We're jumping into part 2 of Jesus in Galilee, and we're going to start to unpack the various people groups that Jesus interacted with around the Sea of Galilee. And today we'll be looking at the Herodians of Tiberias. If you ever visit the land of Israel and have a chance to go to the Galilee, I hope that you get the opportunity to go for a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. I mean, not only is this absolutely stunning, but it gives you a 360-degree perspective of the lands where Jesus lived and carried out the bulk of his public ministry. And as you stand on the deck of that boat and look around the sea, you're gonna see all of these different cities, many of which we're gonna unpack over the course of this series. But today, I wanna talk about this place, Tiberias. And this is a picture of the modern city of Tiberias, between 40 and 50,000 people. And this city was actually built during Jesus' lifetime, and it was a major city on the Sea of Galilee. But interestingly enough, there is no record in the biblical text of Jesus ever coming here. It's mentioned 3 times, once just as a place name, and then twice in John chapter 6, where people leave Tiberias in boats and come in search of Jesus. But even though Jesus never comes here, Tiberias is going to loom large over the region of the Galilee because it is a city that is representative of one of the groups of Jews that Jesus is going to interact with. And in order to understand the mentality of this group of people, it's really helpful to know a little bit about the background of Tiberias as well as a background of the Herod dynasty. So this is a artist rendering of what Tiberias would have looked like in the first century. You can see it's much closer down to the shore, not up on the hills. And Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, built this city, and he relocates his capital from Sepphoris, which Brad talked about in the previous episode, over to the Sea of Galilee, and he names it Tiberias, and he does this in honor of the new Roman Emperor Tiberius in order to curry favor with him. Now, Antipas, during the course of construction, runs into a little bit of a problem when it is discovered that where he's building the city is on top of a cemetery. And of course, in the Jewish mind, this makes the city unclean, and it leaves Antipas with a little bit of a PR problem. If you're building a Roman city in honor of a Roman emperor in your Jewish country and you can't convince any of your Jewish citizens to move there because it's unclean, that's a problem. So Antipas resorted to all kinds of tax incentives. He gave people property, he gave people homes, he freed people from slavery in order to move them to this Roman city. And because it's a Roman city, you find all of the trappings of Greco-Roman and Hellenistic culture. You're going to find hot springs and Roman bathhouses and theaters that are introducing new and provocative ideas into the countryside. And then, of course, wherever the Romans are, that's where the money is. So Tiberias becomes an economic engine on the Sea of Galilee related to the fishing industry. So when fishermen would bring their catch ashore, they would come to Magdala, where there was a salting center, and the fish would be salted, and then those fish would be transported to Tiberias for export. But here's the heart and soul of what you need to understand about Tiberias. Tiberias is a Roman city built with Roman money to honor a Roman emperor, and it is a purveyor of Greco-Roman Hellenistic values and culture. And as such, Tiberias is going to become representative of this group of people known as the Herodians. And for our purposes, we're just going to define the Herodians as people who support the pro-Roman Herodian regime. Now, we don't know if that was like an official political party that people belonged to, or if it was just a loose association of people who were in support of the Herod family. But one of the things that's interesting is that in 3 different places in the Gospels, Jesus is going to interact with this group of people. And in every single one of these stories, it's a setting of conflict. There's opposition between Jesus and the Herodians. Another really interesting facet to the Herodians is that there seems to be a connection between them and the Sadducees. Now, they're 2 separate groups, but often the Sadducees had common interests that brought them into alignment with the Herodians. So we know that the Sadducees are a group of aristocratic Jewish families, many of them priestly, and they understand that in order to preserve and protect their wealth and status, they need to be on good terms with the Romans. So a lot of times their interests overlap with the interests of the Herodians, and you find them in league together. In fact, biblical scholar Paul Wright says that there is a connection between Herod and the Sadducees, perhaps based on expediency, as both were, and this is going to become important in just a minute, anti-Pharisee aristocrats with interests in preserving the economic and political status quo. And so maybe the best way to begin to understand the mentality of this group, the Herodians, would be to look at the identity of Herod the Great, and by extension, the Herod family. So Herod the Great is this massive figure that just looms large over the 1st century, the New Testament era. And when you start to delve into Herod's identity, where Herod comes from, things get very interesting. So racially, Herod is actually Arab. His mother, a woman named Kipros, is a Nabatean princess from the Nabatean kingdom to the south. They built the city of Petra. So Herod has this Arabic background. But he's also an Edomite. His father was from Idumea, which is the Greek term for Edom. And so he is from this ancient adversary of the people of Israel from the line of Esau, the Edomites. But Herod is also Jewish, sort of. Now here's what I mean by that. When Herod's family was in Idumea and the Maccabean kingdom won its independence from the Seleucid Empire, they began to push back into lands to the south, into the region of Idumea. And when they came there, they gave Herod's family a choice. You can either convert to Judaism or you can die. And of course, Herod's family decides to take this forced conversion to Judaism. And so he's Jewish, even though technically he's not Jewish at all. And so one of the pieces of propaganda that the Herod family is going to have to contend with throughout their entire dynasty is, how can you be king of the Jews when you're just a half Jew? You're not even really Jewish. So he's got this very complex identity, but Herod is Greek to the core. I mean, if you know anything about Herod's legacy with buildings and architecture, he is Greek through and through. Bathhouses, theaters, stadiums. Herod's vision of the good life is Hellenism. I mean, Herod was an amazing athlete. One thing that a lot of people overlook about Herod is that he was once voted president of the Olympic Games for life. Greek was Herod's first language. So in terms of his cultural identity, Herod is just Greek to the core. But when it came to politics, Herod was Roman through and through. Herod and his family, the Herodian dynasty, they understood that their bread was buttered by the Romans, and so they are always going to walk in lockstep with the Romans. Now, when you look at all of these different pieces of this complex identity to this family, it almost feels like they're a walking, talking identity crisis. But here was the genius of the Herod dynasty. They knew better than anybody how to walk back and forth between the different aspects of these identities. They knew how to flex this aspect of their identity in one moment when it was to their advantage. And then they knew how to backtrack and flex a different aspect of their identity when it served them. New Testament scholar William Simmons writes this: "Thus the Herods lived a kind of go-between existence, yet were always careful to tie their fate to those in power." And that, my friends, is exactly the mentality of the Herodian party. These are wealthy, powerful people whose primary interest is how do we preserve our power and advance our agenda. This is a group of people who are perfectly comfortable speaking out of both sides of their mouth, making alliances in one breath and turning right around and breaking them in the next breath when the reality on the ground changed. A Herodian had no problem watering down their faith and accommodating to the culture around them and compromising if that's what it took. I mean, to a Herodian, that is just the price of doing business. So a Herodian walks into every scenario and every situation, and they're wondering things like, who do I need to befriend here? Who do I need to betray? Who do I need to bribe? Who do I need to marry? Who should I murder? How can I sow discord and disinformation among the factions around me so that I can create division that's going to make it easier to move my own agenda forward? In fact, I think if you had to choose a phrase to capture the mentality of the Herodians, you could just say that their mindset was strategic ambition. They are politically maneuvering, calculating people who care only about themselves. And you see this kind of chameleon-like shape-shifting by the Herodians in one of these conflict stories where they come to Jesus and pose a question. And so in Matthew 22, we read, "Then the Pharisees," did you catch that? "The Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. 'Teacher,' they said, 'we know you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are.'" So there's some flattery going on here. "Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Now, let's start to pull apart some of what's happening in this story. First, we've got the Herodians, and we've already discovered that the Herodians are pro-Roman. They are pro-Herodian, and they're also anti-Pharisee. But they team up in this story with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees are anti-Roman. And so you just see this kind of slimy, they're willing to make alliances with people they have nothing in common with in order to eliminate a common enemy in Jesus. And here's the backstory. The Herodians feel threatened by Jesus because if Jesus upsets things with Rome, that is going to be trouble for their economic reality. The Pharisees feel threatened by Jesus because he has become so popular with the crowds, and he's a threat to their religious authority. And so they team up and ask this question about taxes. And the question, really behind the question is, Jesus, do you support the resistance against Rome? And here's where it gets really interesting. Where and when they ask this question to Jesus is huge, because they ask it in the temple courts during the last week of Jesus' life at Passover. Well, Passover is the celebration of Jewish independence. It's when God acted decisively to liberate his people from their pagan oppressors. And here we are a couple of thousand years later, and the Jewish people once again are ruled by these pagan oppressors. So what happens in a Jewish heart at Passover? There's this fervor for God to do it again. And the Roman governors of Judea understood this. And so during Passover, they would bring troops from the coast at Caesarea and station them in the Antonia fortress to look down into the temple. But they would also take soldiers and station them among the columns along the perimeter of the temple court in order to listen in on what was happening so that they could respond quickly if anything were to break out in the temple court. And so what is at stake in this question about the tax? It's not just any tax they're asking about, but what's called the census tax. And this was a tax that was to be paid by any person who had been conquered by the Roman Empire, and it was to be paid annually in the form of a silver denarius, and that denarius would have the image of the emperor, and usually on it, it would have a message that said something to the effect of, "Caesar is Lord." And when this was put in place, it infuriated the people of Israel. In fact, in 6 AD, a guy named Judas the Galilean led a revolt. He was eventually captured, the revolt was put down, but his resistance sparked this heated debate in the land of Israel that raged during Jesus' lifetime over, should you pay taxes to Caesar or not? And that was sort of a litmus test for, do you support the Jewish resistance? So you see the bind that they put Jesus in with this question about whether or not to pay taxes to Caesar. Because if Jesus answers, no, don't pay the tax, well, there are Roman soldiers listening in, and they're going to hear that anti-Roman talk, and he's probably going to be arrested, and he's probably going to be brought to trial. But if he says, yes, pay the tax, well, then the crowds are going to be irate with Jesus because he doesn't support the Jewish resistance, and they're going to see him as religiously compromised. And so either way, Jesus stands to lose with this question. And of course, you know the story. You know how Jesus responds. He asks for a coin. He says, whose image is on this? And he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And this, of course, makes the Herodians happy because Caesar is given his due. But then Jesus says, and give to God what is God's. And this, of course, is going to make the crowds happy and the Pharisees happy because they understand that what Jesus is really saying is Caesar isn't God. And his answer is just brilliant. Their jaws drop and they walk away amazed. But what I want you to capture about this interaction between the Herodians and Jesus is that they put him into a dangerous conversation. And the way Jesus carries himself in this dangerous conversation distinguishes him and his followers from the Herodians in two really important ways. And I would just say those ways are integrity and vulnerability. Because if you're a Herodian and you get put in a dangerous position, a dangerous conversation, what do? You change your story. You lie. You switch sides. You water down your message in order to make it more palatable. But this is not how Jesus operates. Jesus is a man of integrity. In fact, I think you could just say that Jesus is the same person in every conversation, in every room. And he has integrity even when it has the potential to cost him. I think you could just kind of step back and say that when people use power to pursue self-interest like the Herodians do, it always leads to exploitation. But where and when you have the integrity of Jesus that's willing to take risks and be vulnerable for the good of others, you see people use power sacrificially, and that leads to flourishing. So there you have it, friends. That is the Herodians of Tiberias. And even though all of this is about a group 2,000 years ago, my guess is as you hear about these Herodians, it sounds awfully familiar to you from the world that we live in. So my hope for you this week is that you will find all kinds of opportunities to walk with integrity and to tell the truth, even when it's costly, for the good of your community. May you walk out this text well in your life.